Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations with artists, writers, and curators. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 89. Today's guest is Julia Dixon Evans. Hey there, folks. Welcome to the show. Today I'm talking with writer Julia Dixon Evans. Julia Dixon Evans is author of the novel How to Set Yourself on Fire, published in 2018 by Dzanc Books. Her work can be found or is forthcoming in McSweeney's, Paper Darts, Pithead Chapel, Fanzine, Flapper House, Hobart, San Diego City Beat, and elsewhere. She is senior columns editor for The Coil, an imprint of Alternating Currents Press, nonfiction editor for Noble Gas Quarterly, and hosts the brand new literary reading and workshop series Last Exit. She is the former program director and editor for So Say We All, a literary nonprofit and small press. She lives in San Diego. So I read Julia's novel, How to Set Yourself on Fire, last month and really enjoyed it. The book is about a woman named Sheila. She's in her mid-30s and sort of aimless. She is caught up in a certain ennui, but it's not quite right to call her a slacker. Rather, she's more struggling with depression and anxiety, I would say. She has a crappy apartment and crappy temp jobs, no real friends and a strained relationship with her mother, and sort of an unhealthy obsession with a delivery guy she met once at an old job. Then early in the book, her grandmother dies, and she sort of inherits this cache of old letters between her grandmother Rosamond and this man Harold, who used to live in the adjacent house to her grandmother. But she only has one side of the conversation, so there's a lot that's sort of a mystery about the relationship. And that mystery is what propels the plot along, as Sheila tries to figure out who Harold was and what happened between him and her grandmother. At the same time, she's developing a relationship with her neighbor Vinny and his daughter Tori. And, well, there's a lot going on here, but what really made this book stand out to me is voice. That is, Sheila's voice. The book is told in this very close first person, and you get this really absorbing view into all of the details of how Sheila thinks and feels in this way that makes her into this amazingly well-realized character who somehow manages to be relatable and interesting even when she's making, well, some of her decisions are not perhaps the best decisions, let's put it that way. Anyway, I was very excited to talk with Julia about this book, not least because I always love talking to local San Diego artists and authors. Before we get started, a couple of things. First, I mentioned that Julia is the host of the Last Exit reading and workshop series. Well, coming up on July 27th, Last Exit is having their next reading, which features Kristen Arnett, Tommy Pico, Sarah Rose Etter, and Lilium Rivera. The full details haven't been posted yet, but keep an eye on lastexit.org for details and follow Last Exit at Last Exit Lit on Twitter or Facebook for updates. There are links in the show notes for all of that. Also, for subscribers to the KTCO Patreon campaign, I'll be adding a new reading to the bonus archive. This time around, it'll actually be me doing the reading, and I'll be reading Julia's short story Ghost Stories, which was originally published in Monkey Bicycle. That will join readings of poems, stories, and excerpts by authors including David Bowles, Lydia Kiesling, Shivani Ramlochan, Rachel Lyon, and more. All Patreon subscribers get access to a private podcast feed with all of the bonus content, plus all of the regular episodes which post a day early. Your pledges are what keeps the show going, so if you find these conversations valuable and would like to hear more, please consider making a monthly pledge at patreon.com/sakeriver. That's sake like the drink and river like river. Okay, so here we go. As always, if you'd like to join in the conversation, you can use the hashtag ChannelOpenFiction on Twitter for your comments and questions. And now here's my conversation with Julia Dixon Evans. Before we get started, the first thing I wanted to say is that I really enjoyed your book quite a bit.
You.
And I thought it was kind of interesting. So we met at AWP this year, which is very funny since we live in the same town and we met 1,500 miles away. And you very graciously signed my book, and I thought it was kind of funny that you wrote something about. I actually have the copy here. You wrote, "Enjoy this strange book."
Yes.
Which I thought was a funny way of doing it, but I was trying to think of like whether or not I thought the book actually is strange. I thought it was good. Sort of when I'm thinking about the structure of it, a lot of the plot sort of revolves around these letters that the main character, Sheila, sort of inherits when her grandmother dies, right? And, you know, when I think of like the sort of epistolary letter format for a novel, I wasn't quite sure whether this exactly fit that model, but I wanted to sort of get your thoughts on whether you consider this book to be an epistolary novel or something else.
That's such a great question, because I think about that all the time when it's like on the tip of my tongue that I would describe it as an epistolary novel. And, I think in the sense that it is a foundation and they form a really specific structure to the book, but it's not all of it. I think it's like the absence of letters that is what propels the plot in a way. So it's like the parts that are not epistolary are the true plot propulsive part. So, but yeah, I hesitate to call it epistolary because it is not entirely in that form. Yeah. And to master that genre is to be able to propel plot, to show how characters live and are and breathe without ever having them act. Yeah. And mine only does that with a few characters. Yeah.
It's an interesting thing. This thing that you were saying about, oh gosh, I can't remember exactly the phrase you just used, but it was something that I was thinking a lot about how, the letters that sort of propel the plot, and provide the sort of backbone, like this sort of mystery of these letters, that you only have one side of the conversation.
Right.
But it struck me that like having only one side of something was sort of a kind of recurring theme throughout the book, that there were a number of ways in which characters are referenced but don't appear, you know, or that you wonder about what you're only able to wonder about them because they don't actually speak. Like, for example, Sheila's father, who I wasn't even sure if he gets a name.
No.
But he's definitely a presence in the book insofar as he's a presence, like a constant presence for her. She's thinking about him a lot, but you never really get his side of the events that unfold that she describes. I thought that was interesting. It seemed like there were a lot of things like that. And I was sort of wondering how, like what is it that sort of attracted you to that form?
Well, I think it goes back to letters in a way where as I started writing this, it wasn't, before I started, it wasn't the seed of it in any way, but, I found this box of letters from when I was a teenager that some long distance boyfriend had sent me, and they were so eloquent and I could remember none of it. And, clearly they were responses where he would answer questions. He would pose questions to me that I clearly answered in the next letter, but I have no idea. I don't have that half of the archive. And that's not how the world operates anymore, where you search for someone's name in Gmail or even in your text messages, and you can find the last thing that you said to them. You can find a full archive of a full conversation. And that wasn't the case when people were just writing letters. And so that really built the mystery, I guess, of the plot. Is like, what else is out there? What's the other half? What did she say in reply? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I thought it was, like in some ways, because the story is so close in perspective to Sheila, like everything is, it's very interior to her experience, that in some ways it almost seems like even the characters that do appear, like for example, her neighbor Vinny, who, her relationship with him forms a very important part of the story. It's always a little bit of a mystery what exactly he's thinking at any given moment. And then she actually even spends a lot of time thinking about what is he, what must he think of me kind of thing.
And the thing with Sheila is she'll never have that conversation with anyone. She'll never ask. She'll never go to somebody and approach them in that way of searching and answering her wonderings. She'll leave them as wonderings. So
yeah, I found Sheila to be a really fascinating character, and when I was reading sort of like the different reviews and other interviews and things that talking about this book, something I wasn't necessarily sure I wanted to go in this direction, but because it seems like it's a thing that other people consistently want to talk about or mention, is whether or not she's a likable character, which that obviously has a lot of baggage to it. But I thought it was, I actually found that I did really like her.
Right.
But that's such a difficult question to sort of, reckon with everything that goes along with that question. And I sort of was curious how, how your thought process is towards, like, both in developing that character and then sort of in, talking about the book after the fact.
Right. I knew you were going to bring up that word as you started introducing it. I'm like, I know which word it's going to be. The unlikable word.
I hate to be predictable, but.
It definitely came up, and I knew it going in, and I think maybe it was even in our pitch, like as we were sending the story out on submission. I think the word may even have been in there as a way of reclaiming it, or of taking permission to have this woman who is unlikable. I think it's more prominent to see men who are unlikable, and we love them for it. We're charmed by it. But when a woman is an unlikable character in a story, it's like all that she is identified as, and rather than just like one part of her character.
Right.
So I think that I really wanted to take that on. I wanted to tackle it. And it really is hard to talk about unlikability without also talking about sexism. And I think in Sheila's case also ageism in some way, which is funny. When I started writing the story, I was younger than her, thinking, by the time the book comes out, I may be the same age as her. But now I'm like 4 years older than her by now. It took that long. So I do think that thinking of this like mid-30s character who spends a lot of the book interacting with a 12-year-old girl, I think that is a big part of the language too, like a weird older woman being unlikable.
I mean, it is sort of just even saying that a woman in her mid-30s is older.
I know, right?
Like you wouldn't think of like a male character in his mid-30s as being,
No.
In our culture, we still refer to the like mid-30s guys as like, oh, he's a good boy, like he's a good kid.
Right, exactly. And I mean, when you think in terms of like movie main characters and leading roles, that would still be like a romantic lead, whereas someone Sheila's age would just be like the spindly older. I feel like I can say this now that I'm older than her.
Well, I mean, it's just, it is a very, I think, minimizing kind of question to like sort of reduce these characters to likability. That's sort of why I was a little unsure about whether I even wanted to bring it up.
No. I love talking about it.
Yeah.
And I do think that it was, I took it on head on as like a project or something I really wanted to distill down into a story and say, like, almost try to figure out what my thoughts were. Like, what did I think of unlikable characters? Let's make one and see how I can work with her in a story. And honestly, I think most of what I write, there's some element of unlikability to the characters, just because that is what is interesting to me. I think most people have those tendencies, and we just wrap them up differently.
Yeah.
We either have our social niceties or the things that are let's say someone who is super nice and has a very good heart, they may still have this feeling about themselves, or they know that something that they do is unlikable, where to the rest of us, we would be like, no, you're pure and holy, whatever. But to them, they may have something that is like, that's my unlikable part. So I think everybody could relate to having an unlikable side, having something that they kind of either shield or keep hidden or compartmentalize, maybe.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that question of relatability is in a lot of ways more interesting than the question of likability, because that was something where a lot of the things that it seemed like Sheila sort of thinks about and the ways that she expresses herself, and even she has a lot of sort of self-destructive kind of tendencies, were things that I could relate to, not necessarily on the same, like to the same degree, but certainly of the same kind.
Right.
I kept thinking throughout the book, there was this Twitter meme that, I mean, and maybe you've seen it, but like it was something like, am I perfect? No. But am I trying my best? Also no.
Also no.
And it's only funny because it's like, yeah, I can think that's everybody, right?
Right. Right. No, I feel like with Sheila, in terms of her, like the interaction she has with other people, and in terms of the relatability element, these were all things where I could feel them in a very real way as I wrote them. Mm-hmm. Like I could see myself either imagining having this conversation or actually having it, or knowing that that is the course a conversation might take were I not to choose to say something that's a little more socially acceptable. Mm-hmm. And that's not to say that she is entirely always this baser version of myself or a baser version of someone with a filter. Like, I do think there's more to her than that. So
I found her to be pretty compelling, because I mean, I think what it really is that she just felt really real, like even in the ways that she might be like to some degree dysfunctional, like those are all things that are, real people are like that. Like we all have our dysfunctions and we all have our, like one of the things that I found so interesting about her is that she doesn't always make great choices, but she's also very aware of how the choices that she makes are, like sometimes even before she does it.
Right.
And that's also something that I found really, you do something sometimes or say something just in your real life and you're like, well, why did I do that? I don't know. Why did I do that?
Right. Absolutely. And those moments where you're like witnessing the poor choice being made, you're witnessing, this is the moment I could change this. This is a moment where I could stop this downward spiral, or I could stop this decision or this awful thing that I'm about to say or do, and I'm not stopping it. And what's funny is that I think not until I was a parent did I ever quite realize that. I don't think I've had such a volatile relationship as those I've had as a mother, where it's so easy to be aware of how a conversation or an argument with a child is like going south, and you're like, I'm engaging in a power struggle with my daughter. Like I should stop. No one's going to win. This is a poor choice. If I win, I lose. If I lose, I lose. There's no winner. And then I'm still powerless to stop for the most part.
Yeah.
But the awareness that I have found on several occasions in the middle of those things, I'm like, that is something that I recognized in Sheila as I wrote her. That moment of clarity, of enlightenment. I think there's something somewhat admirable about that, that's not necessarily beyond relatability. It's not necessarily beyond likability. And then, of course, Sheila would just say the absolute worst thing to say to her mother or to her neighbor.
Yeah. Yeah. Something that another thing I like from a sort of technical standpoint that I found really interesting, so I think kind of plays in where you were just saying something about, like, you can kind of see a conversation going in more than one direction, but then in several points in the story, you actually show side by side, like, two different ways that a conversation could go, which I found really interesting. And that's not something I can really recall seeing before in, certainly not like in literary fiction. I mean,
right.
But one of the things that I thought was, so structurally, I thought that was very interesting, but also the fact that at the end of it, either way, the conversation ends up in more or less the same place, right. But also you never tell us which way the conversation actually did go.
Right. Right. I love that, actually. I love doing that. And, it was one of those things where I'm like, okay, that was fun, or that was cute, or that was like some narrative exercise. I'll cut those before I send it out for anyone to read. And then I never did. And I wonder if a part of what I loved about those in the story was what it did for that sense of here's how a conversation could turn, and here's how in control we are. And also not in control of those things. I mean, structurally, I was sort of inspired by Jennifer Egan's book, Welcome to the Goon Squad. That's the title, right?
I haven't read it. I have heard of it, but not enough to know if I have the title exact.
Yes. Well, I think I read it on a Kindle the first time I started reading it, and it's like, please go to our website to download the PDF file of the PowerPoint in the middle. And I'm like, the what? A PowerPoint in a novel. And then I eventually got a copy of the book, and it really is like page after page of this PowerPoint in the middle of the story. And, in that sense, I'm like, okay, if someone can put a PowerPoint in a novel, I'm just going to do a couple little tables. I can get away with it, right?
It is. I mean, I like, there's something really interesting about ways that a novel can be sort of experimental in form. It sort of reminds me a little bit of a lot of the poetry that I've been really interested in lately, like Franny Choi's poetry or Fatima Asghar's poetry will include like diagrams. The poem is a chart, or something like that, which I find really fascinating, but it's not something that I feel like I see in fiction a lot. Right. And something like that, I feel like done, not well could feel really gimmicky, but it didn't feel that way here. Like I want to say that it sort of like called attention to itself in a way that made me sort of pay attention in a different way to what was happening in the story. And that there's this sort of, like emotional truth to the choice and to the moment that happens in such a way that you almost don't really need to know what happened, which I thought was also, just as the book as a whole, seems to sort of follow that same pattern, where there are times when you don't know exactly what is happening or what has happened or necessarily how it resolves, but that it doesn't necessarily matter because the path you took to get there was satisfying in itself. Right. And I do think that those conversations could also just not have happened. There's that, when you get to the end of it, there's the either or. Which one was it? Did she talk to the male temp recruiter or the female temp recruiter? Did she say this one thing to her mother or the other thing? There's also this element of like, actually, neither of those could have happened. Maybe she didn't even go through with making the phone call, which, as an aside, that would be the most relatable thing for me. But I think in terms of it being a gimmick, I'm always worried about that sort of thing because I know that for me, it's like a selfish, it's like a selfish sort of tool as a writer to explore things like that or to play with things like that, where I love to test the edge of form, or I love to test the more unknown elements in a narrative, like rules that I can break, or places where I can really obviously play with rules. And I love that. I love doing it. And I think it breaks through writer's block for me, or it will pull a story out of nothing. Like I wrote a story once just going by like a clickbait title, and then that's all I had. And I was like, oh, I'm going to write this like total clickbait. And
then it turned into a story that I would never have written otherwise.
So, I mean, I'm kind of interested in that thing that you just said about it being a selfish impulse, because, like, I guess I just sort of wonder, is that, like, if you were reading someone else's story or book or something and you found something that was sort of experimental or rule breaking or something, like, do you feel like generally that's how you would feel, or?
No, not at all. It's just like me being unfair on myself, I guess. I think when I encounter those things, those things that play with structure or form, or even just test my boundaries in any way, I am always challenged, and I often will do my best to read into it. Like, what does this serve that is greater than its form? It's here for a reason. I know it. Yeah. So in that sense, I'm more fair on everyone else except myself, I guess.
I mean, that's relatable.
Right. It's just me being relatable here on the podcast.
I mean, I find, for myself, like when I'm, I do write, but, primarily if I'm known for anything other than the podcast, it would be my photography. And I go back and forth a lot, because I find that I have these sort of twin impulses as a photographer, where I, on the one hand, really, and this never has anything to do with anybody else's work, because I just like all kinds of different kinds of photography, right? But there are times when I feel like a real photographer wouldn't need to mess with their photos or do something like make sculptures out of them or like paint on them or do any of that kind of bullshit. They would just take a straight photograph and that's it. And that's how you become a master photographer, is just, those are the people, right? But at the same time, then, like, I also find myself saying, well, why not? Why can't I, make something that is an object, or make something that, where like things are folded or things are like stitched on or like heavily photoshopped or whatever. Like, what's the problem with that? And then most of the stuff that I end up doing is like kind of fucked around with a lot.
Right. Well, that sounds cool. I think it's funny you mentioned photography, because at least in like film photography, there's only so far you can go with messing with the form and the structure, or like the picture won't take. Like you can't just like write completely differently like you could in fiction, but there's like these limits to creating something visual with technology like that I feel like at least you are making art. At least you're producing something.
Well, sort of. Yes and no. I mean, I don't know. I guess what I sort of, the thing for me is just that, like, I find that I also am very sort of wary in my own work and nobody else's and I'm very like sort of nervous about being gimmicky. Mm-hmm. But like, I mean, and there are definitely times when I've looked at somebody else's work and thought, oh, that is gimmicky. But for the most part, there's like the general idea of experimentation in form and stuff like that, I more often find it really exciting.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that I will say that I read one of those sections aloud at a reading, and I think that might be the limits of the form, is reading it out loud. I think it was a shorter one, so I was able to like get through it and have it be somewhat entertaining still. But I definitely, as I was reading it, I was like, oh my God, this is a poor decision. I should stop. I should walk off stage. Just go home.
So, another thing that I was thinking about with this book is how much obsession plays into the book. Mm-hmm. And in particular, there are two sort of characters or sort of ways that manifests that I found to be parallel, but they manifest sort of in different emotions. And I kind of wanted to unpack that a little bit. Is that on the one hand, you have Sheila's obsession with this, delivery guy that she met once or twice and becomes obsessed with him.
Right.
But also you have in the letters Harold's obsession with Rosamond that, and the way that that's presented in the book, the way the characters think about and talk about these two things, that Sheila kind of really beats herself up when she's not giving into that obsessive impulse. She really sort of seems to think about it as something kind of shameful. It seems to me,
right.
But also, but like when she and Tori or, anybody is talking about Harold's letters, it's not like that different of an impulse, but everybody talks about it like it's really romantic. And I thought that was fascinating, that sort of dichotomy. I wanted to sort of see what you thought about that.
No, I mean, that's a big part of it, is like she is approaching this discovery of these letters and trying to figure out who Harold is as she's reading, and Harold's obsessive personality like really gets stronger and stronger as the book progresses. They're like dosed out throughout the book. It's all tempered by her own experience of doing the same thing in a very strange way. Like she really does have only one remnant of that person, Jesse Ramirez. And that is one letter that wasn't even meant for her. She found it on the ground, and it may not even have been from him, but she builds it up in this really, really, all engulfing way. It's almost like she dives in voluntarily to the obsession. She keeps it in a drawer. She will drive herself over to his house. She'll stalk him. All of those things are very, you can't do them entirely on autopilot. Like there is something there where she is knowingly getting into this stuff. And I think in that sense, the obsession that she is struggling with is, it's like feeling how she is eating up these letters from Harold as well. But of course it's like, oh, this is a historical thing. There's two sides to it somewhere. Let's set out on this quest to find the other letters. There is something really romantic about that quest that almost overpowers what really was going on in Harold's letters. And also he's this like charming gentleman.
Yeah. But he's also like right from the very beginning, very insistent.
Yes.
He's not taking no for an answer, or not even a no, but just like not taking being ignored for an answer.
Right.
Which, I mean, that too was a very interesting, the fact that, I don't know, I feel like if that were now, it would not seem charming.
Right. Of course. It's like, I guess what Harold does is he really does lay it out there at the start that he has one goal, and that is to get this name of a doll so that he can replace the doll that was ruined over his fence. And it's, again, one of those things that's like, this behavior in a man is like dashing and charming, and everyone always says how they love that first letter. It's funny, and Harold is endearing. And it really does make you think about those male characters in media where it's just like a character quirk, their persistence or obsession. But I really do think that Harold was just like completely lovesick as well. And it's like, put those two things together and you have quite the storm.
Yeah. Yeah. Why don't we take a little break and then we'll come back and do the second part. Okay, so for the second segment, I always invite the guests to bring a topic of their own, which could be whatever you'd like to talk about, whatever happens to be on your mind. So what would you like to talk about today?
I have no idea. You were supposed to tell me. I thought we agreed on that beforehand. I I don't know. Could we talk about like the absolute lack of things to talk about, which is not necessarily how I operate in my daily life. There's always something to talk about. But,
yeah.
We could talk about how one of the things that I wouldn't say that this is one of the things that I've found a lot of creative joy from, but there is some element of satisfying in that. It's almost like the same compartment of creativity is going into the wilderness by myself to go running. Like that's something that I didn't used to do. I would always think, oh, if I'm going on a trail, I will go alone, or I will not go alone. I will take someone with me, always go on group runs, which are really agonizing for me in terms of like competitiveness or what have you. So I started going running by myself a couple of years ago, and I feel like it's something that feeds me, but also scares me at the same time. And I wonder what the parallels are with creating art. I know there's something to it, but maybe that's what we talk about.
Yeah. Well, so what I'm thinking of there is, first what I'm thinking of is that I really miss running, that I, up until, about 4 or 5 months ago, I was a runner, which that in itself is something that would have just utterly shocked and disgusted my teenage self. One is just that I miss running, and I really appreciate it if my legs would, get through this rehab process. But, when I think about what I get out of running, what I tend to find is I was actually just talking to a friend of mine about this, the night before last. I don't really like using my body that much. I find it kind of physically unpleasant. Right. But there is something really great about if you can get into sort of a groove when you're running, and it's like there's no past and there's no future. There's just the feeling of my feet on the ground and a rhythm and the feeling of my breath going in and out of my lungs.
Right.
That is sort of the purest form of presence that I ever actually get. Like I don't seem to achieve that by not like I try real hard to meditate, but I don't really get anything like that anywhere else. And I think that's the thing that I miss about it the most. And I do usually run by myself. It's one of the things that like running with other people sounds kind of awful to me because I wouldn't be able, because I'd have to feel like I'd have to talk to somebody or pay attention to somebody else instead of just sort of getting lost in the moment of it.
And that was all very beautiful what you said about like that very meditative, distilled down action of running. But I do think that I definitely cut my teeth, at least as a non-child. So in high school, running with groups. And it was always like, don't be last. Like this like stress of approaching a group run about how something bad is going to happen to me. Everyone will resent me. Or maybe the upside is like, I'm the fastest one on the run. And then I'm resenting the other person who's having like gastric meltdown or whatever in the back, which honestly has never happened, that I'm the one resenting somebody else. But I still stress out about that in group runs. And I think that I was injured a couple years ago. I had a stress fracture, and coming back into running, I just didn't want to deal with running with other people. I wanted to run for a half a mile and stop. Or I wanted to maybe run 2 miles, or I wanted to go out there for 2 hours and run some of it and walk some of it. And I didn't want to have to explain to anybody or answer to anybody or have somebody else be inconvenienced by my recovery in any way. And I think that's when I really was like, oh, this is better.
Yeah.
I really like being out here. And what's funny is that I love the relationships that I form with other runners, particularly women. Like having that group of women that I run with is really, that's one of my favorite things is those people and having those connections and bonds. And it's funny to say out loud, like, I hope no one listens to this, but it's funny to say out loud how problematic it can be for me, like on the interior. We were talking earlier about like witnessing and being aware of things completely spiraling out of control and knowing what you could do to change it, but letting it spiral out of control. That I will have those meltdowns on a run when I'm running with other people, and I will be like, I'll just stop and cry on a trail somewhere. And that just doesn't ever happen when I'm running by myself. And yeah, I think that one thing that I'm up against a lot is like my own fear and everybody else's expectations of me going out somewhere alone. And I think that I could easily say like, oh, I'm brave, but I'm not. I'm just kind of somewhere between stupid and curious is maybe more like it. And
well, I mean, listening to how you were describing the difference between running in a group and running by yourself, there is something that does seem like a bit of a parallel with the creative process in that, for most of us, when we're making something, it is a fairly solitary activity. Some people do collaborate, but oftentimes even the collaboration is more involving passing something back and forth rather than working in the same space at the same time.
Right, absolutely.
And there is something that is very pure, I find, about feeling like you can do whatever you want, like you're beholden to no one but what your own desires are. I'm not sure I ever actually get there with my work,
Right, right.
I do get there with running, like being able to just sort of listen to my body and what it needs right now, whether like knowing when I can push it and when I have to sort of ease up, and I can do that entirely on my own terms and
right.
just be taking care of myself. That seems kind of aspirational as an artist. Like if I could just think about exactly what I want instead of trying to figure out how will it land. That's
right.
Yeah.
Or even how to finish or how to make something, but thinking about what you're trying to achieve or what your product will be. I think that there's so many like famous runners or athletes that it's really hard to not think of them like Murakami. Or I read somewhere that Joyce Carol Oates in an interview, she said that if she's having she's stuck in a plot problem, she'll just go outside and do hill repeats and then come back and sit down and finish writing the scene. I think it's Joyce Carol Oates. I could be completely wrong, but this idea where writers and people who like physically exert themselves are living in these parallel worlds and they feed off of each other. And what is it about writing that attracts a kind of person who is inclined to do a little bit of like self-punishment or do something that pushes the edges of what is comfortable physically, emotionally, or also like pushes the edges of what they're afraid of or what they're used to doing. So
I think I do my best writing when I'm able to access a place that's very immediate, where I haven't overthought it, and where it's very sort of honest and vulnerable. And I think that there is something about when you are pushing the limits of your physical endurance that it can access a similar sort of emotional state. Like, I don't know about you, but sometimes, like, the longest run I've ever done was just over 11 miles. And I wasn't training for anything. I just was like, I'm going to run around Lake Miramar 3 times. And and I got like about a mile into the 3rd lap and just couldn't do it anymore. And I couldn't go any further. And I had this just total emotional breakdown, you know, like I couldn't sit down because my body wasn't able to do that.
Your legs weren't going to bend.
Right. But I just was sobbing like on the trail, and people were walking by and, you know, seeing me sobbing.
Right.
And like,
and they don't know you've done it 2 times already. Yeah. Like, these people just got out of their cars.
Yeah.
But no, that's amazing that you went to your limit. Like, it's not often that people do that because it's risky. Yeah. I mean, you could have gotten really injured, right?
Yeah.
We're told not to do that for a reason. But this idea of like going, like flirting with danger in a way that is not actually going to, it's not like you're in a sword fight or something, or jumping off a cliff. You're still doing something that's not a good idea. You're pushing the edges of what you're physically capable of. And I'm not surprised you had that emotional breakdown.
I was just so disappointed in myself. I was like, I'm going to do this. And then I didn't. You know? But I think it's not, you know, even as I think about it, whenever I've ever made anything, whether it's a piece of writing or a photograph or anything, it has never turned out the way I wanted it to. And there's always been something about it that's profoundly disappointing to me. And often that will last for years. And that it's only after, you know, spending a long time after I've been done with it that I can come back and say, this isn't completely terrible.
Right.
And I think that there is something about that too. It seems like maybe not a terribly dissimilar place of, you know, I've done everything I can to make this what I wanted it to be, and yet it is not. It is only in that failure to have it be as great as I wanted it to be that it is able to be anything at all.
Right. Right. And like you're striving beyond where you reach. Like, I think that is something that I struggle with in art, and all artists struggle with. Like, your aims for your own products, your taste in the type of work you want to create it's almost always beyond your capabilities or beyond what you're producing. And so it's like, you have to keep shooting for that or you'll never come close. Or if, let's say, like, you're not shooting beyond your capabilities, you're going to be making not something that's not up to your potential.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's like this idea of playing with the gap between your taste and your capabilities until, like, repeatedly trying, and you'll close that gap, supposedly.
Yeah. I like the thing that you were just saying a minute ago about artists being willing to go to a certain place of self-punishment, almost,
right.
You know, because I don't know, like, well, even just the title of this show is Keep the Channel Open. And that's from, it's from Agnes DeMille's biography of, Martha Graham. Oh man. That, you know, the two of them, I haven't read the whole biography, but I read this one passage from it that just really clicked with me, where Agnes DeMille has just she's just opened Oklahoma, and she's talking about how all that she can see in it is the flaws and the limitations and where it didn't live up to what she wanted. And Martha Graham says, but like, no artist is ever satisfied. And like, the best you can do is to just keep yourself open to what's there. But I think, like, I don't know, it does sort of require a certain, I'm not sure if endurance or fortitude or maybe masochism to be willing to constantly go up against that sense of disappointment, you know?
Right. I think it can wear on you. And I think that I had done it so, rashly for so long, almost like embracing it as a creator, as a writer, that I am like in this place right now where I'm worn down from it. And to approach something with great risk like that is really daunting. It's hard to sit down at a paper and say, I may fail. I may not do what I'm setting out to do. I may not have anything that I'm setting out to do. And, I think that is where the real endurance is, that willingness to try anyway. I don't know. I wish there was an answer to that, because I feel like
answers, right?
Right, exactly. But it's funny, like, to talk about this in the same conversation as talking about trail running. I often think in terms of it's like a subversive act to go out in the wilderness as a woman alone and be like, okay, I may run into a mountain lion, or I may run into like a bad guy out here and I'm by myself, or I may just fall and have to get myself out of there. And I think by countering this societal expectation that I wouldn't do that, or that I shouldn't do that, is part of what drives me, where I'm like, no, haha, I'm going to do it. And I think that what I'm also trying to find in my writing is that same sense of like feisty, where I'm at this point right now where I'm not creating new work, I'm not writing, and I just want to be able to say like, haha, I'm doing it anyway. And I don't know. I think it's just a time thing. Maybe I need a little more time to pass, or maybe I need free time.
Yeah. Well, that's pretty hard to come by for most of us.
Is there a writer who has the time they need to write?
Yeah. I have definitely been struggling a lot with output recently, especially with writing. Something that I've noted in myself is that it's always very easy for me to continue photographing, because photographing is just something that's very sort of instinctive and immediate for me. Because photography is largely reactive for me. Like I'm not building something to shoot. I'm just noticing things.
Right. I mean, can you approach writing in that same way? That's
the thing that I always wonder is like, could I just write something, and you know, like I write a tiny letter, for example. A lot of the stuff that I might like, just sort of observational stuff would, you know, go into that, because I don't know, it's hard to sort of find a home for weird little one-off thoughts.
Right.
But, you know, I think too, like I've had some thoughts about some stuff that I want to write, and I've been circling around it for some of it for like 2 years. And these aren't like, it's not like I'm thinking about writing a novel. It's like I'm thinking about writing like maybe a 3,000 word short story or something, you know?
Right.
But I can't seem to quite get myself there to the point where I can actually put words on the page. And I think that it has to do with that fear, you know, of the disappointment of knowing, like I know that when I actually sit down and write this story, it's not going to be the story that I wanted it to be.
Right.
And that is just really hard to get past that first thing, you know?
Right. So this is like, teaching writing 101 right here, Mike. This is like what I have always taught students is write anyway, like write those observations in a form of journaling. Like this is your daily practice, is taking you're not photographs in your text maybe, and not having expectations for them.
Mm-hmm.
Like maybe that practice will turn into a permission or that leap to your next thing.
That idea of permission is, I think, an important one. And it seems like it's both in terms of trail running and in terms of making art. Like how does anybody, I mean, it's on some level, it seems like almost like an arrogant thing for anybody to feel like they have permission to make art, you know?
Right. Oh my God. Right.
Or, you know, permission to go out in defiance of what the social expectations might be and go running on a trail by yourself as a woman. Mm-hmm. Finding ways to give yourself permission for things like that. That's, I think, the trick that a lot of us are trying to deal with, right?
And I think that you can approach either as like that fire or doing something in a really robust way, or doing something in a really meditative way where you're just going to keep repeating a behavior until it is your habit. Somebody I recently interviewed was talking about how he thinks of himself as a writer, and he said that you are what you repeatedly do. And I think of that over and over again. Like, I think of that a lot, that you are what you repeatedly do. It's very meditative. It's very, it's almost like a litany where do something over and over again and you become it, or create something over and over again and it becomes something. I don't know. I think I'm getting a little existential here.
I'm here for it.
All right, good. Yeah. But yeah, I love those little ways where the inspiration that we seek is not anything like I ever thought inspiration would look like as a writer. And I think so much of my inspiration is like coping mechanism. Like, how can I write despite this? Despite me being a stuck writer? Or how can I write despite me being a writer who doesn't know how to finish my story? Like I wrote most of this book in a month, and then it took me a year and a half to write the ending. So it's like, how can I write despite not having an ending? How can I solve this problem?
Yeah.
And I love that is not at all the glamour of being a writer, where you're like, wait, I got to write down this amazing dream I just had that's going to all fall together glamorously as I write, the wind blowing my typewriter keys. That doesn't happen.
Well, it's one of my favorite things is when like some writer will share on Twitter, like, I wrote down something like my dream in the middle of the night last night, and then convinced that it was brilliant. And when I woke up and looked at it, this is what it said: hot dog pancake, or something like that. You know,
I feel like that was a Kristen Arnett tweet, right?
I know I've seen more than one person do it. It's always hilarious.
Yes.
I never get tired of it. I do love Kristen Arnett. She's pretty great.
Right.
So there's one question that I like to end with, and that is, if there is a piece of art or literature or creativity in some form that you've experienced recently that meant something to you.
I think by nature of some of my work, where I freelanced for the Culture Report for Voice of San Diego, where I'm constantly in this like primarily visual arts and culture scene in San Diego, where I'm trying to write about that. It's hard for me to separate like being inspired by visual art from literature, but I'm going to go with a piece of literature right now because it's still so fresh in my mind. And that was, I just read The Book of X by Sarah Rose Etter. And that is a book that blew my mind. And I think that it made me want to sit down and like type her exact sentences. I wanted to sit down and like feel what it's like to write like that. It's profound. It's a beautiful book.
Great. Well, thank you so much for talking with me. I really appreciate it.
Oh my gosh, thank you.
Okay, so there we are. If you enjoyed today's conversation and want to get your own copy of How to Set Yourself on Fire, which I highly recommend, there's a link in the show notes. And if you're in the San Diego area, do be sure to check out the Last Exit reading coming up on July 27th, 2019. There's a link in the show notes for that as well. And that is our show. You can follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at Channel Open Pod and on Facebook at facebook.com/keepthechannelopen. And if you'd like to respond to anything you heard today or even just say hi, you can send an email to podcast@keepthechanneleopen.com. If you're enjoying the show, please do help us out by telling a friend, leaving a review, or subscribing to our Patreon campaign, or even just shoot me a quick tweet saying, hey, good job. Our theme music is by Poddington Bear. You can find more of his music available for licensing at soundofpicture.com. We'll be back on June 5th with a new conversation, so do be sure to come back for that. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.